Hello, and I'm very excited to welcome you to the first session of the UAE-Israel Business Leaders Summit. In this panel discussion, we'll be focusing on the opportunities presented by the Abraham Accord. Following the signing of the treaty, leading financial institutions in the UAE and Israel have agreed to advance ties, providing services such as financing, investment banking, and corporate lending. But how will these tie-ups help Israeli business clients set up activity in the UAE and Emirati entities launch operations in Israel? How will cooperation benefit both nations? And are there any potential hurdles to overcome moving forward? My name is Emma Brain. I'm from Gulf News, and I'll be your moderator for this session. And I'd like to welcome our two panelists. We have Dr. Abraham Ortal. He's the CEO of Lumi Partners, and Dino Kronfall, Chief Investment Officer of Global Sukuk and MENA Fixed Income at Franklin Templeton. Gentlemen, hello and welcome. It's a pleasure to have you both here.
Hi, hello. It's a pleasure to be here.
Same here.
Wonderful. So first off, my first question to both of you is, what are the synergies between the two countries that make it viable for investment opportunities? Dino, if I can start you with that one, please.
So thank you for that. And it's, again, wonderful to be here with all of you. I think first and foremost, this is a region that both countries share. And so as such, I think the leadership in both places have a responsibility to create a more prosperous and peaceful future for its citizens, particularly the younger generation. I think also, there are significant Israeli capabilities in areas like defense, technology, water, agriculture, and so on, which could really help support, I think, the UAE's efforts at developing their economies, diversifying it away from oil. And then I think in reverse, I think the UAE can provide some capital, can provide logistics support, and can provide, an attractive tourist destination for consumers as well. So, this is the beginning of a long journey, but it is certainly a very positive step in the right direction.
And Dr. Abraham, what are your thoughts on that?
I actually agree with everything that was said. I think in terms there are many similarities between the two countries. First of all, we're very close. We're 3 hours away in terms of flights. We very much face the same political threats around us. So there's sort of an alignment of interest between the two countries. We have a Western business culture, and I think the UAE also has a Western business culture. So we talk the same language, and we understand each other very much. And obviously the UAE being a hub for us on the Mediterranean, a hub in our area, and also a gate to the east, is something that definitely could be utilized in the future. And obviously the oil and gas sector, which is very strong in the UAE, but also is strong in Israel, especially on the gas exploration front and on the downstream side. So I think there's a lot to do in terms of cooperating and looking at downstream opportunities and innovation relating to the petrochemical industry. And obviously the other areas of innovation, whether it's medical devices, agrotech, food tech, etc., which we'll probably talk on afterwards. All these things really make it very exciting for Israeli companies and UAE companies to basically join together and try to do good stuff.
Well, staying with you, Dr. Abraham, because you kind of went into my next question anyway. What are your expectations on investments and which sectors look promising?
I think, as I said, the downstream petrochemical industry, and again, we talked about diversification from the oil industry on the one end. On the other end, the UAE just recently had a very large gas field, the Jebel Ali gas field, which was just explored, 80 TCF, trillion cubic feet, which is huge. Makes it, I think, 6th or 5th in the world in terms of gas reserves. And I think Israel can offer a lot of innovation, on what to do with the gas in terms of downstream activity, producing methanol, producing MTOs, producing a lot of continuing products to that. So that's one interest, one field which will definitely be utilized. Obviously, the food tech, the agrotech, which are very developed in Israel, and also we can bring a lot of know-how. other technology sectors like cyber, digital health, defense. But I also think that the industrial sector in general in Israel and in the UAE could join forces, because one of the advantages, again, is really the gate to the east. And I think Israeli companies who would like to set up operations in the UAE could benefit a lot from, workforce, from Israeli know-how, UAE know-how, and a very convenient gate to the east, which we never had before. So these are sort of the things which I think will be the focus in the future.
And Dino, what are your thoughts? What sectors do you see apart from those upcoming? As you already mentioned, the UAE and Dubai in particular is becoming less reliant on petrochemicals, and tourism is becoming a big thing. Tech, smart cities is becoming a big thing. Where do you see it going?
Yeah, so you're right. Energy in the UAE is already less than 30% of their GDP, so it's not the main motivation. They've been largely successful, I think, in really diversifying away from oil. The rest of the region still has some work to do, and as my colleague mentioned, Dubai sets a good example in that respect. The way we look at things is we feel like in the beginning, a lot of state actors will probably play a big role trying to establish, I think, these linkages. So whether it's airlines or big banks or state-sponsored or government-related entities that really sort of dive into energy and other areas. But then the rest, I think the expectation really would be for the private sector to start lifting, doing more of the heavy lifting. And there, we touched on it. I think it's going to be very broad-based. Today, when you talk about technology, it's not one sector or the other. You're really applying technology across sectors. And I think here, what is exciting, I think, for everyone is that bringing or doing this deal or opening up these relationships, what it does is it adds, first of all, I think, Israel's GDP of 400 billion to the region, which now becomes a very impressive $4 trillion. So it's a very large market. It's got 450 million people. And, it becomes much more realistic to start thinking about how they can really tackle some of the longer term challenges. Because, in the past, if you look at any sub-region within us, it always lacked something. The GCC may have, capital, but not so much in terms of population. The rest of the MENA region may be populations, but not so much in terms of wealth. Israel, again, relatively small, but lots of technology, maybe not as large a market to address. I think when you start thinking about it collectively, the opportunity is enormous. And I think you start thinking about, really having a viable way to tackle some of the medium and long-term challenges the region shares. So things like water scarcity or climate change, or the transition away from, carbon, into a low carbon world, or even just mobilizing the private sector to be able to, diversify economies, but also start attracting money into the region, and to start really changing, if you want, the day-to-day, experience of the population in the region. And I think that's ultimately the goal that everyone here is aspiring for.
Thank you, Dino, for that. And Dr. Abraham, coming back to you, how do you think financial institutions can play a key role in connecting Israeli companies and Emirati organizations to create bridges for doing business between the two countries?
Well, I think, in any cross-border transaction, there are three questions which are usually asked by both parties. One is, what do I want? What are the wants and needs for each one of the parties? The other one is really, how do we get there, and how do we bridge all of the gaps and all of the unknowns, in the two countries? And really, the third one is, how do we execute it? And I think bankers on both sides of the transaction could facilitate all of these questions. We can definitely help because we know our clients very well, and the same thing for the other side. So we can really help them identify the needs and the wants, and then talk between ourselves and see how we can really get the right partner to talk with the right institution. That's one thing. In terms of the how, obviously there are different cultures, there are different rules. We can help them really bridge that gap and help them come prepared for the meetings, help them get the material done. And obviously, in terms of execution, we can facilitate the deal either by the structuring it, by providing capital to the deal. So I think in that, it's really no different than any other cross-border transaction, which we always recommend to use bankers. Well, obviously, because we're a banker, but I do feel that definitely in a relationship which is new and haven't done before on the business side, definitely bankers could help really reach a much better optimal resolution on these three steps.
And Dino, what are your thoughts? How do you see this working?
No, I agree. There's a very critical role for bankers here to address. I mean, clearly there is the issue about providing funding, but I think he's very right. The issue of providing advice and trust is going to be critical, because clearly there's a little bit of a catch-up that needs to take place. I mean, we are talking about decades of really not having built these linkages, and this is going to be an important place for banks to really step up and fill those voids or those gaps.
And so how do you see investments in capital markets and cooperation in banking services? Dino, I'll stay with you for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if the momentum builds and this really carries on and we see the normalization really, catch on and start including, more of the region, I think first and foremost, it's going to really make, I think, capital more available and more competitive. And I think that's going to be, to the benefit of everyone. So the risk premium, so to speak, I think for the region starts really diminishing. And then I think as these linkages develop between the public and the private sectors, you start seeing the GDP of the region re-rate. So growth opportunities, I think, increase and accelerate. And I think the region just becomes, a much more attractive destination for capital. And, since we are in an environment where, interest rates are very low globally and growth is challenged in much of the developed world. I mean, if you can create an environment that is attractive, has growth opportunities, has yield and return, you're going to find that capital is going to need to be channeled into our region. And so for all of this, banks and financial institutions, but also regulators, all have a role to play. And so that's why we're so constructive on these recent developments.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Abraham, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with Dino, and I think also there are a lot of new things that or new financial instruments that are used in the UAE, and we don't know them here. I mean, Dino is managing the Sukuk fund, so obviously that's something. I mean, we don't really invest here based on the Sharia, and we don't know what Sukuk is. Definitely, these sort of new financial instruments could be very beneficial for Israeli and Israeli Arabs, and that's a huge market which we can get introduced. Obviously, the Israeli community has a very large VC and PE funds that are operated here and that are really a good bridge to a lot of the technology base. We can introduce UAE capital to these funds as well. So there are a lot of products and financial institutions which are different in the two countries that we can actually help facilitate and get together.
But there is going to be a little bit of a learning curve taking place on both sides. So what do you see are the financial barriers for making investments between the countries, as well as promoting joint investments in the capital markets? If I can stay with you for that one.
Well, I think that, we started the conversation by talking about the synergies, so we can talk about the differences as well. I think the culture, I think the one of the things, first of all, UAE is a global player, and the funds that are played in the UAE are playing on a global field. So Israel is a very small market for them, not always very interesting, because when you look at the opportunities that, looking at the PE VC side, so there are a lot of opportunities that are open for UAE players, and not necessarily Israeli market would be interested for them. Obviously, language, I don't think language would play a major role, because we all speak English and we all speak American and we all understand the Western culture. And the rules, I mean, the rules are different on the one hand, but on the other hand, when you go to and operate under a FDIC, so you're operating on a common law rule, which is very easy, and we know securities laws. So these are the things. I think notwithstanding the sizes and the enormous market that the UAE has, I think there are a lot of opportunities that could be actually interesting for UAE players in Israel and vice versa.
Dino, do you see any major challenges to overcome on this front?
No, I'm reasonably optimistic that we shouldn't have any issues. And, just if you look at the recent uptick, I was at the airport yesterday. I mean, 5 flights from Tel Aviv. It's already moving, I think, a lot faster than even, the most optimistic views were. So I'm not worried about these types of issues. I'm a little bit maybe more concerned, not me, but I think the markets as well. I mean, there is still some heavy lifting that needs to take place for these accords to become entrenched, for the confidence to build. I mean, there are other important, significant players that ideally should be part of this. And there is still the outstanding issue of the final status of the Palestinians that needs to be resolved. So these are, I feel like we've taken a very important step, but there is still some work to do to really kind of entrench and really build a strong foundation here. So that's we just don't want to roll back, if you want, some of the progress. That would be the biggest issue from our perspective.
Well, as you say, there's lots of learning and baby steps to begin with, looking forward to fantastic partnerships in the future and down the line. So how do you see funds playing a role in supporting investment and trade between the two nations? Dino, I'll stay with you.
Funds are always going to be looking to really promote, the area that they're investing in. So, when you have this, region that's more peaceful, that's more collaborative, fund managers and just the asset management industry in general will be doing everything it can to really promote it as a destination and try to attract this money. Already the region has done a very good job recently, promoting investor interest, from changing their bankruptcy regimes, making it a more attractive destination. And these types of developments will go a long way. And so, they've been successful, but I think if we can really build on, what's occurring here, it just makes their job, I think, more important, but I think it makes more scalable as well. And so you'll find fund managers will be very much looking forward to this picking up momentum.
And Dr. Abraham, your thoughts on that last question, please?
Yeah, I always feel that using fund managers, whether it's private equity funds, whether it's venture capital funds, or whether it's hedge funds, are always a good gateway for any economy, because you get a diversification, you get the bridge of a qualified team that really helps you. So I think if you want to start and invest in any country, the preferred way is to actually start with a fund before you do direct investments. So I think, and as I said before, the UAE has, starting from the sovereign funds all the way to the family offices, which are there, would benefit a lot from looking at the Israeli private equity funds, venture capital funds, and hedge funds, which invest in technology and all of the areas we talked before. It will be a really good way to sort of understand the economy, understand the trend, looking at the portfolio, stuff like that. So I do think that the funds on both sides would have a major role in starting sort of the business dialogue between the two countries.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your thoughts and taking part in our discussion today. We have come to the end of our time. I would like to thank you, Dr. Abraham Ortal, CEO of Lumi Partners, and Dino Kronfel, Chief Investment Officer at Global Sukuk, and Mina, Fixed Income at Franklin Templeton. Thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been a fantastic, informative and insightful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Welcome. Thank you.